Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter on Substack. You can subscribe to Cutting Through at mitchellplitnick.substack.com, where you can also donate to support this work. If you find this valuable, please like and share Cutting Through with your friends and contacts. We are at a point where we really need your support. We are hoping to continue to expand the things that we're bringing to you in the videos and research as well. And so, if you can support this work, please do so. There's actually some interesting things happening today, but before I get to the main topic of this video, excuse me, um, I wanted to just mention something, and this is a bit personal, but also I think very important in terms of how we treat progressive media, progressive news, and just really, thinking about how we put our day-to-day knowledge of what's happening into action. So, over the weekend, the New York Times published an article on Project Esther, which is a project of the Heritage Foundation um, that seeks to identify all support for Palestinians and Palestinian rights with essentially with Hamas, with terrorism more broadly. It's a giant smear tactic, and it's been in play for some time now. Um, Heritage is making a secret of it. It's right there on the website, and it's been reported. Um, and the Times did a decent, I think, article. Has its flaws, as one would expect from the New York Times. um, but it also, I think, it did expose what Project Esther is, and it's important that that gets out there. The reporting from the Times got echoed by a lot of progressive news outlets. This morning, Democracy Now, for example, did a piece on it, and that's wonderful. The issue I have um, is that 6 months ago, the outlet I write for, Mondo Weiss, where I write a weekly column, and is not exactly an obscure website. It certainly isn't the New York Times by any means, and it certainly brings a particular viewpoint. It covers mostly Palestine, but broader issues in the Middle East, and it does cover them from a pro-Palestinian point of view, as opposed to the pro-Israel one you get in the New York Times and so many other media outlets. But it's far from Palestinian propaganda. It certainly is. They have printed things that are quite critical of things that of groups and including Palestinian groups that are popular in some cases among progressive movements. In any case, Mondo Weiss published an article, and it was written by me 6 months ago. 6 months back in November, um, about Project Esther. That revealed everything that the New York Times revealed this weekend. And the New York Times, of course, revealed it as if no one had ever heard about this before. It's not like when I wrote this article, this was blowing the lid off of something. Again, it had been out there, and it was mostly just a sort of codification and a playbook of things that had been going on already. Um, but it was a more concentrated and concerted effort, and it has escalated in these 6 months. It escalated almost as soon as Project Esther took off, before Trump took office, before Donald Trump took office, and certainly has gone into even higher gear since then. The issue I have is not so much that the Times pretends as if nobody knew about this until they published their story this weekend, but that the progressive media largely ignored an article that I think was pretty important. And certainly they seem to think it was pretty important, because once the Times reported it, it got much more play from progressives. That's not what we should be seeing, folks. And if we want to be serious, and we talk all the time about how mainstream media does not cover politics in general, not just Palestine, but politics in general, that the mainstream media does not cover it well. Well, when you have alternatives, you have to promote them, because the average person who may really want to know what's going on in Palestine, who may really want to know what's behind various political machinations in Washington, who may really want to know what Trump is doing and would want to know it from a source that isn't beholden to a Democratic Party that is as self-interested as the Republicans. You have to promote those media sources. You have to promote those stories. And when I see that Democracy Now! Ignored this story for 6 months and then waited for the New York Times to publish something and then didn't exactly didn't exactly focus entirely on the progressive um, viewpoint of it, but instead brought on the very New York Times writer who wrote the article. Um, that is not how you promote progressive media. That is in fact encouraging people to rely on very, very flawed sources like the Times and mainstream media. I mean, if we're going to say that the Times is worth looking at as authoritative when it comes to Project Esther, then why weren't they authoritative when they were reporting all the many, many lies they reported on, for example, on October 7th, 2023, and how they magnified so many of the false claims that Israel made? To such an extent that there were several scandals about the New York Times coverage as well. We could also say the same about the BBC. We could say the same about most mainstream media outlets. But just complaining about it isn't helpful. We have alternatives. We have more reliable, more diverse, more sincere. I mean, I'm not going to tell you I think Mondo Weiss, for example, gets everything right, but I can certainly tell you they try. I can certainly tell you they're not trying to put out propaganda. They're the people who run Mondo Weiss are people. They're human. I'm not going to say they never made a mistake in their lives, but they do not tailor their news to a particular agenda. They do unabashedly take a pro-Palestinian editorial perspective. They are explicit about that. They are upfront about it. But they don't color what they write. I have written things that I thought the editors might come back to me and say, this is really out of step with what we do. They've gone ahead and published it without blinking an eye. So I can tell you firsthand that they don't do that. I can tell you firsthand that a lot of alternative media outlets don't do things like that. I have written for many. I have known many people who are writers, who are journalists. I've been in this field for 20 years. I know editors. I know publishers. I've worked as I say, worked in the field. I have published in many, many outlets. If we want to have a better media, we have to actually do something about it. And I'm not talking about making this your career. I'm talking about when you get a good article from Mondo Weiss that tells you something that, hey, this is important, promote it. And so I'm saying this both to individuals who can then just send it out to their friends or over social media, but also to outlets like Democracy Now! Who really should be doing better than this. Okay, it shouldn't have taken 6 months for Project Esther to be a story for them when it was handed to them 6 months ago, but they didn't take it seriously until it showed up in the Times. So that is, to my mind, something that has to change. And I think personally that this is something that the folks at Democracy Now! Who are terrific, and don't get me wrong, Democracy Now! Is an invaluable media source. And they themselves do a lot that also needs to be promoted to a wider audience. But in this particular regard, I think they dropped the ball, and I think they need to be called on it, quite frankly. Okay. Moving on to the events of the day. I think there was a really, really big development. At least in the broader picture. I can't say for certain how much immediate impact it will have, though I think it will have a lot. I'm kind of optimistic about this, and I'm referring here to a barrage of statements, but chiefly the one that came from the United Kingdom, France, and Canada that came at Israel and threatened Israel with, as they say, targeted sanctions, whatever that means, if they do not stop their expanded offensive into Gaza, and if they do not allow aid into Gaza. I'm going to break that down and actually read you uh, read you or annotate the full statement in just a moment. But before I do think it's important to have a little context on this. This is, as we can certainly see, highly unusual. And it's also obviously not nearly sufficient for the moment, although it would have been sufficient for the moment a year and a half ago, or even a year ago, I would say. It would have met the moment then. A year later, it does not. And I will explain that further as I break down the statement. It's still significant that it happened, though. And it's not an accident that it happened uh, as just as Donald Trump came back from a trip to the Middle East that didn't just skip Israel, but basically cut Israel's concerns out of almost everything he did there. I have a piece at Mondo Weiss that I published at the end of last week that goes into this a little bit, and I think we should be clear. Donald Trump is cares nothing for the lives of Palestinians. That I think is abundantly clear. He does not care. Um, Donald Trump cares about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump pursues his interests, and that's what this Mideast trip was, as I explained in my article. And if and the one thing that Donald Trump I think really highlights is that Palestinians have nothing to offer him, and the truth is, Palestinians have nothing to offer any president of the United States or any prime minister in Europe. The only thing, the only reason to support Palestinians is because you support human rights, because you support justice, because you know it's right, because you know that what's being done to Palestinians is an unimaginable and despicable crime that ranks up there with any in all of history, and it isn't only for the last year and a half. It's been, certainly for the last 77 years, but I would argue well before that. But certainly since the Nakba began, it has been an ongoing and severe crime that has been tolerated by the entire world. So why has it been tolerated? Because again, Israel offers the world something. I think what it offers is often exaggerated, but it does offer the world something. It's part of the sort of Western system, and it plays a role in there in terms of generating wealth, in terms of generating technology, in terms of intelligence, geostrategy, all the different things we can think of, and of course Palestinians offer nothing in any of those regards. In fact, Palestinians threaten that agenda because if Palestinians should ever win their rights and their freedom, that would be an inspiration all over the world, particularly in the global South, but also in the global North and in places where, like in the United States, where there are historically oppressed and marginalized people who often feel like everything is so stacked against them that the best they can do is hope to eke out what they can from a system that is geared against them. A Palestinian victory stands against that and inspires people to really go for and believe that they can attain their full equal measure of rights that most of us, especially those who are in the relatively privileged classes, including myself, enjoy and often take for granted. So Trump positions himself in a place where he cares about what Israel is doing in Syria, because that is not working towards his interest or the interests of his cronies in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. He cares about what Israel is doing with Iran because he does not want to see a war in the Middle East that will destabilize the region and hurt not only his cronies but himself. He and his family have significant business interests, particularly in the Persian Gulf, and a war between Israel and Iran will severely disrupt that and could permanently damage a lot of those investments. So he cares about that. And so he has proceeded to take action to avert those things in ways that cut Israel out of the picture. With the Palestinians, he doesn't do that because he may prefer that Israel not be so extreme, and I think he's starting to recognize that he needs to take some actions with regard to Israel and its extremity, because he has been so indifferent that they've even gone off the hook even more than they were already under Joe Biden, which is an amazing thing to contemplate. Um, but he has essentially been indifferent to this one way or the other. He's now started. There are now starting to be some rumblings of some threats, but I think his basic indifference to that, as opposed to the sort of full-throated backing, and I'm not talking necessarily so much about public statements here as I am about what I'm getting wind of, and what we see some hints of in some media outlets, about how what the attitude is in Washington and how it's shifted under Trump as opposed to under Biden. Um, he has essentially adopted the principle that he has been explicit. Trump, I mean, here has been explicit about even before his first term, which was that he doesn't want to lecture other countries about human rights. He wants them to take care of their own business. He does not concern himself with how human rights are violated in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in Israel, unless he has to be, unless there is a reason for him to be, unless there is an interest for him. That relative indifference, I think, is part of why we are finally seeing the incredibly cowardly and incredibly feckless European leaders and allies starting to dip a toe into stating their minds. I mean, I think we started seeing this, last week. We really saw Spain take a pretty bold step. Again, relatively speaking, it's again nowhere near what should be, but a relatively bold step by saying outright that Israel's committing genocide, and that infuriated Israel. I don't think that issue is yet at its end. So we'll see if there's more chapters to that. But that was good to see a European country actually saying something that's true about Israel and about what it's doing. I think that was important. And then we get to today, and I think the statement that was issued by the United Kingdom, France, and Canada, that actually threatened Israel and called on Israel to stop its operations and to allow aid into Gaza. I think this statement does not happen unless Trump is, and the United States has shifted away from the full-throated support that we saw, the passionate, the zealous support that we saw under Biden, or even the sort of general support that we saw under previous presidents like George W. Bush, Barack Obama. Trump is different. Trump, I think, really feels like he'll let Netanyahu commit genocide. He'll let Netanyahu wipe out Palestinians if there's no political loss for him. He really doesn't care. And I think that's where where that comes from. And it is a difference. He does not care if Israel's image in the United States is tarnished. He doesn't care. If American popular support for Israel wanes. Biden cared, and I think other presidents cared as well, because they were sort of part of that whole sort of pro-Israel network one way or the other. Trump isn't, and I think whereas somebody like, for example, George H.W. Bush might have taken some controversial, again, relatively speaking, stances on Israel, because he saw it as being in an American interest. Trump is interested in Trump, and his definition of American interests tend, especially in foreign policy, tend to line up pretty closely to what he thinks Donald Trump's interests are. And as a result, he is just much less concerned about Europe, for example. He says, if you want to take this stance, I think he feels like, go ahead. No skin off my nose. Whereas other presidents tended to actively discourage that. So I think that's how we get the statement from the UK, France, and Canada that we got today. So let's get to that statement. Because on the one hand, it is a very, very encouraging statement. It is something that again should have been said a long time ago, and it's good that it is being said. And there's some reason to hope that there will be results from it, as you'll see as I break it down. Um, but is also still well short of both the standards of international law and just the basic standards of ethics and morality. So let's look at it. So this is the joint statement from the leaders of Canada, the United Kingdom, and France on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank. And here's starting, and I will quote and unquote so you know where I'm talking and where they're talking. So, quote, we strongly oppose the expansion of Israel's military operations in Gaza. The level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Yesterday's announcement that Israel will allow a basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly inadequate. So let me stop for a minute there. Today, Israel allowed 5 trucks into Gaza. 5. They said they were going to allow 100 trucks in Monday through Friday. So today they did 5. Those 5, they said, were basically restricted to baby food. So that's nothing. I mean, that is 5 trucks is nothing. It is not even a drop in the ocean. The 100 trucks in 5 days would also not have been a drop in the ocean. This is an entire population that is on the brink of starvation. This is, I mean, the images that I'm sure many of you, but certainly I have seen it almost as a tidal wave. The suffering and the starvation, the messages I'm getting from friends and colleagues in Gaza are heartbreaking, and not only heartbreaking but infuriating in the cruelty that Israel is displaying here. To call this wholly inadequate, and to acknowledge that Israel will allow a basic quantity of food. No, they're not. They're not allowing anything close to a basic quantity. That implies that there's at least a subsistence level of food coming in, and there will not be that. That is also, let's recall, just what is coming in. There is still no real mechanism within Gaza to distribute that food. So yeah, the trucks are coming in. They'll get to a warehouse where they can unload it. But how is that going to get to the people? I mean, it's certainly what's going to happen. Very likely, is that people will find out where there is some food, and there will be a mob scene of people desperately trying to get something to feed themselves and their children. There is no distribution mechanism right now in Gaza. There's no way for people to distribute food to civilians in Gaza because Israel is shooting at everybody. Okay, so let's continue on. We call on the Israeli government to stop its military operations in Gaza and immediately allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. This must include engaging with the UN to ensure a return to delivery of aid in line with humanitarian principles. We call on Hamas to release immediately the remaining hostages they have so cruelly held since 7 October 2023. So there is at least an acknowledgement that Israel has prevented not just the entry of aid, but the distribution, which I think is really key. That is not, from anything we've seen, going to change. It is not clear that at all that Israel will allow UN mechanisms to deliver this food. There's still all this talk about an American governmental nonprofit that is going to do this, and other weird schemes. It's very, very unclear how this aid will be distributed, if it will be distributed at all. And there's also, and I think it's worth noting, the pro forma sentence at the end, the call for the release of hostages. And let us be very, very clear here. The taking of hostages is a war crime. And that is true whether you are the occupier or the occupied. Okay? Taking of hostages is a war crime. It also, by the way, if you take soldiers as hostages, that is also a war crime, which is hostages not the same as a prisoner of war. We should be very clear about that. The problem is that these statements are so, again, one-sided. Israel has taken thousands of Palestinians hostage. They call them prisoners. They don't call them hostages, but they are hostages. They are people who have been rounded up in both Gaza and the West Bank over the past year and had been thrown into Israeli prisons, often tortured, almost always mistreated very badly, coming out looking haggard, often looking starved, um, and with some of the most horrific stories, which in many cases have been, there has been video proving it. There has been testimony from Israelis that have substantiated it. So we know that these things are going on. Now, yes, there are those who are combatants who have been so detained, although the mistreatment is illegal, whether these people are combatants or not. But a lot of these are simply people that Israel rounded up because they knew they were going to have to exchange hundreds of Palestinians for every Israeli hostage. So the hostage issue is on both sides. It is happening on both sides. In fact, it's happening in much greater numbers with Israel holding Palestinians hostage, and it is a war crime regardless. It is a war crime regardless. And so, yes, we should call on Hamas to release the hostages. We should also call on Israel to release the people that they have taken and are holding without charge, which is most of them. We should acknowledge this in every statement. Here's the as I mentioned, this is a pro forma sentence. You always have to say, whenever you're talking about letting aid into Gaza, whenever you're talking about human rights violations against Palestinians, you have to call on Hamas to release the hostages. If you don't do that, everybody jumps on you. And yet somehow, when that situation is reversed, the same standard is not held. Okay, when people say the hostages must be released, for example, or Hamas must lay down its arms, or any of these other things, there's no concomitant statement that Israel must stop killing Palestinian babies. There is no concomitant statement that Israel has to free people from its torture chambers in its prisons. That doesn't have to happen every time. And this is where that double standard is visible again. It is not to say that the hostages, that Hamas or whomever, because not all of them are being held by Hamas, or at least weren't, that the hostages, the Israeli hostages in Gaza, should not be released. They should never have been taken. They should be released immediately. The same is true for Palestinians, and we should be saying it just as often, and we're not. And that has to be pointed out and noted every single time you hear this stuff about Israeli hostages. It's not just one side. Innocent people are being held hostage. All those people should be released. Even if they're not innocent, if they're being held hostage, they have to be released. I will remind people, international law does not permit soldiers to be held as hostages. They can be held as prisoners of war. They can be held under charge for war crimes, but they cannot be held as hostages. Okay? And that is true for soldiers. It is true for Palestinian combatants. We need to apply these principles of law all over, all sides. And we don't do it. And we don't even think about it. And I think that's where we need to really note this stuff when we hear it. And we need to call it out every single time. Okay, let me continue with the statement. The Israeli government's denial of essential humanitarian assistance to the civilian population is unacceptable and risks breaching international humanitarian law. Boy, do I have to stop there. Risks? Breaching? Risks? Israel has been breaching international humanitarian law since there was an Israel. There is no part of international humanitarian law that Israel hasn't been breaching with regularity. Just look at the reports from B'Tselem. Just look at the reports from any human rights organization. Just look at the Israeli ones. Just the Israeli ones. Look at year after year of State Department human rights reports. It's insane to say that Israel is and that's in normal years without this sort of concentrated genocide that we're seeing in Gaza. It is infuriating to hear this, and yet we hear it so often. They risk breaching international humanitarian. At what point have you stopped risking it, and have you done it? And the answer is there is no point where they say that, and this is where the problem lies. We need to be much clearer, not just in language, but in procedure. And this is a place where, by the way, I will fault human rights organizations as well. there is a point at which you are not you can say that you use, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, whoever. All of these groups use international law, but you're not a court, nor are you a police organization. You are allowed to say when a law has been broken in your view. You are allowed to make that call. It doesn't have legal standing. It doesn't have a legal implication. Okay, a court of law, a system of international justice would still have to make that determination. But you can say it, and you need to. Okay, these calls for investigations might be in breach of international. No, there's no might. Israel has been as clearly in breach of international humanitarian law as you can be from day one of this. And if you're going to say, well, Hamas breached international, you're damn right it did on October 7th. Absolutely it did. Okay. And yeah, we can talk about that too. On that one day, Hamas absolutely committed many major violations of international humanitarian law. And on the 540 whenever days it's been since, Israel's been going nuts committing such violations, and it was doing it before. And again, yes, Hamas had done it before too, as had other groups. And this is the point. When you look at conflict situations, even completely disproportionate conflicts, like the difference between Israel, a regional superpower militarily, and a stateless, virtually defenseless people. Even the stateless, virtually defenseless people can still commit violations of law. Okay, it happens. That's the way that works. Okay, and in every conflict, both sides always commit violations. Okay, so, and yes, they all need to be pursued. They all need to be stopped. They all need to be, there needs to be an account for all of them. Otherwise, what's the point of law? Okay. But what we do instead is we use this delicate language when it comes to Israel, but we have no hesitation to call what Hamas does murder or terrorism. That there we don't hesitate. But with Israel, it is they may be in breach. They are risking breaching humanitarian. Come on, who are you kidding? There are 50. The official death count is now what, I think 56,000 people dead in Gaza, and that is a very, very low estimate. Okay, and the breaches of international humanitarian law that have led to loss of life are much greater than that, without a doubt, because international humanitarian law says you have to allow aid in, and the deprivation of aid have certainly caused many thousands more deaths over the past year and a half. So, and Israel has said that they're doing this. They have said they're disregarding international humanitarian law. They've literally said it. Yoav Galan said it in day one. No food, no water, no electricity, nothing gets into Gaza. That is an explicit declaration of violating international humanitarian law. And it's not just words. Israel did exactly that, and it continues to do it. I mean, we can go down a long list. It is absurd that we're using this language, and it has to stop. It has to stop. Okay, and I understand these are governments, and they have to be more careful, because when a government says so, you could be, that's more of a justiciable accusation. I understand that, but come on. Risks breaching international, come on. The denial of essential, let's say it again, the denial of essential humanitarian assistance to the civilian population risks breaching international law. No. When you make that statement, the denial, if you're saying as a fact that the Israeli government is denying that humanitarian assistance, then they are in fact in breach of international humanitarian law. It's not a risk. There is no circumstance that denial of humanitarian assistance is acceptable. None. There is no, the most basic law of occupation is that the occupier is responsible for the well-being of the occupied people. And it's true in war too. You can't just starve an entire civilian population to achieve your war aims. You can't do it. So, I mean, we really need to cut out this nonsense, and we need to get, if we want to have a world where such things do face accountability, we have to start using language that demands that accountability. Okay, so back to the statement. We condemn the abhorrent language used recently by members of the Israeli government, threatening that in their despair at the destruction of Gaza, civilians will start to relocate. Permanent forced displacement is a breach of international humanitarian law. I do think this is a, I'm stopping here for a minute. I do think this is a veiled sort of jab at the United States, as well as at Israel. In terms of this alleged plan to transfer 1 million Palestinians to Libya, which I think is nonsense. There's no way they're doing that. It's just another one of these things that's like, you know, the Riviera on the Mediterranean nonsense. These are just Trumpian fantasies that can't possibly happen. But when you think about the fact that this is even something that somebody dreams of, I mean, sending people to Libya, especially in such a large number of people, let's say you could do it. And let's even say that you could find 1 million Palestinians who were willing, who would go along with it willingly. You can't, not even close. But let's say you could. What a horrible idea! You're talking about a nation that doesn't even have a complete government. You still have two different factions, vying for power. A major civil war, which is, you know, not raging right now, but that it could be at almost any moment in Libya. Libya is an extremely unstable country. So even if you're talking about what would pay Libya this many billions of dollars to take in debt, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Then you know, if anything, that would actually up the instability in the country. It is an insane thing that people are thinking of. Okay, back to the state. Israel suffered a heinous attack on October 7. We have always supported Israel's right to defend Israelis against terrorism, but this escalation is wholly disproportionate. Let me stop here again. There is no question that war crimes were committed against Israel, against Israelis, excuse me, on October 7th. Israel has steadfastly refused to investigate the events for a number of reasons. You know, I would argue that it is a virtual certainty, considering what we have seen and what has been investigated and what has come out of even Israeli investigations, but also of others, is only a small fraction of the picture of what actually happened on October 7th. But it already shows that the picture that Israel painted that day was not entirely accurate. It shows that to some measure, Israeli forces, when they finally did respond to the attacks in southwestern Israel at the Gaza border, caused a great deal of damage that we've seen, and we're seeing all the, you know, all those firebomb cars that you see. And Hamas wasn't responsible for most of those. They didn't have the equipment to do it. I think, you know, so to some extent, I think there's also, you know, ideologues have pounced on this and said, oh, it was all Israelis, or the Hannibal Directive did this and that, and they killed all of these many Israelis. That is unlikely, I think, number one, but certainly far from established in any way. It happened. We know from the testimony of Israeli soldiers that some deaths of Israelis were from Israeli forces. We do know that Israeli forces fired on some people who were being kidnapped to prevent them being held hostage, and that is what essentially the Hannibal Directive says. Although the Hannibal Directive was really about soldiers, not civilians. But we do know that something. What we have is a very foggy picture. We also have an excellent, incidentally, I highly recommend the report that Al Jazeera did on October 7th, which really shows both a lot of the Israeli falsehoods, but also, you know, a lot of the video that Hamas itself uploaded to their various social media, Telegraph, and other channels that showed war crimes that were being committed that very much included the intentional murder of civilians, in some cases in some pretty cruel fashion, throwing bombs into bomb shelters and things of that nature, shooting people as they came out to flee. Those things were caught on film, so we know crimes were committed. So all of that is important. Israel's right to defend Israelis against terrorism is a fraught phrase. We talk about the right. First of all, Israel does not have rights. States do not have rights. People have rights. Israel has obligations as a state. States do have obligations. One of the obligations Israel has is indeed to provide safety for its citizens. And that is true whether Israel itself is a criminal state, an apartheid state, or not. It still has an obligation to provide security for its citizens. It also, crucially, has an obligation to provide security for those people under its control, whether they are citizens or not. And that includes Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. When you are the occupying power, those people are the security of those people and the safety of those people are, legally speaking, as much your responsibility as those of your own citizens. And Israel has routinely denied that and routinely breached it and continues to do so on a daily, minute by minute basis. Beyond that, if you are a state and you are serious about keeping your people safe, what you do is you stay out of situations or try to resolve situations that are going to lead to violence against your citizens, which kind of, by definition, precludes planting them in occupied territory. It precludes building communities to act as buffers and borders, which is what Israel did years ago when it built the communities that are near the Gaza border. Those were intentionally placed there as buffers against what they called infiltrators from Gaza. And of course, we can talk about the settlements in the West Bank. And you try to resolve these conflict situations, which again, Israel has never tried to do. And people can say, oh, Israel wanted peace and Israel tried to, that sort of nonsense only works when you're talking to people who don't work in this field every day, as I have and as many others have who know better, including some who are pro-Israel, including some who agree with Israel's strategy. But who, in a private moment, we won't say it publicly because it undermines Israel's propaganda and Israel's entire, sort of pitch. But in private moments, when you get into the conversations, they know, and I've had those conversations with plenty of pro-Israel people who are more reasonable and understand exactly what it is that Israel is doing. And understand that, yes, everyone wants peace. Everyone always wants peace. The question is on what terms, and Israel's terms are Jewish supremacy without question. And, I think many of the people I've spoken to who are pro-Israel and who recognize that fact say, all Palestinians have to do is recognize essentially Jewish supremacy within historic Palestine, and everything will be just fine. I don't know if everything would really be just fine, but I think they believe that. In any case, I digress. The point is that, yes, Israel does have a responsibility to keep its citizens safe, and it shirks that responsibility every day by denying the rights and by dispossessing another people, the Palestinians. When you deny people their rights, when you dispossess them, when you destroy their homes, when you make them refugees, when you cut them off from their families, when you humiliate them on a daily basis, guess what? Some number of those people are going to become violent and they are going to attack you. That is the way of humanity. That is the way people are. It has been the way of dispossessed and discriminated and oppressed people throughout history. It doesn't suddenly change because you're Israeli. So if Israel wants to take this responsibility seriously, I'm all for that. I am all for Israel taking the responsibility to keep its citizens safe seriously. And you do that by giving Palestinians their full equal rights. And you'll be amazed how much safer your citizens are. Back to the statement. We will not stand idly by, we will not stand by while the Netanyahu government pursues these egregious actions. I don't know what you think you've been doing for the last year and a half, but okay. moving on. If Israel does not cease the renewed military offensive and lift its restrictions on humanitarian aid, we will take further concrete actions in response. Okay, further concrete actions implies they have taken some action already, which they haven't. There are no actions being taken. Now, there's no question that this statement in and of itself rattles Israel deeply, and that Israel takes it seriously. So, I mean, you can call that a certain action. And we're seeing right now Israel trying to figure out how to respond. And by the time you see this, there may be further developments. But, further actions, I mean, implies that some action has been taken. None has. We oppose any attempt to expand settlements in the West Bank. Israel must halt settlements which are illegal and undermine the viability of a Palestinian state and the security of both Israelis and Palestinians. We will not hesitate to take further action, including targeted sanctions. I do want to give some credit here to the UK, France, and Canada. They could easily have done what most people in the media, even many activists who aren't specific to Palestine or are themselves Palestinian, and certainly governments have done since the genocide, which is completely ignore the West Bank. And the West Bank has been a nightmare since this started. Israel has been severely cracking down. They have emptied out several Palestinian villages. They just passed a law that essentially annexes Area C. To Israel. It does so de facto, not de jure. It doesn't actually say we're annexing this area, but again, you can look to my recent writings as I discuss this. But I want to give them credit. I do, because they are at least noticing, they're at least pointing out that something is happening. They aren't very specific about it, but they are at least pointing out that things are going on the West Bank as well. They didn't have to do that. That being said, this viability of a Palestinian state, who are you kidding? Who are you kidding? What Palestinian state? There is no possibility anymore of a Palestinian state. And this is a fantasy that you can only cling to if you don't actually go around the West Bank and see what Israel has done. Israel has set up its settlements. My old friend Jeff Halper years ago, looked at the settlements that had been established and the proposals for new settlements, and what he noted, and quite correctly, was that they were being dotted around the West Bank in such a way as to establish Israeli control over the entire West Bank, even if they left certain parts as places for Palestinians to kind of manage on their own and live in. He called it the matrix of control, and he was exactly right. That is exactly what Israel has done. Settlements are situated in the West Bank in such a way that that Israel effectively controls the entire West Bank, and allows Palestinians to exist in their pockets, and in the relatively small Palestinian cities, Bethlehem and Jericho, and the very Jenin, and the various Palestinian cities, except of course for Hebron, where again the small portion that is controlled by Jewish settlers essentially dominates the entire city, which is in many ways the situation of the West Bank writ large. This notion that there's still a two-state solution is a fantasy. And this desperate clinging to the two-state solution is very much part of the problem. Now, I'm not saying if you really think that the two-state solution is the only way to go, and you want to hold on to it as a possibility, hey, that's fine. But you have got to start thinking in terms of alternative. You have got to start thinking more creatively, because the reality of the two-state solution is just not there on the ground. What it would take to create that is mind-bogglingly enormous. Israel's infrastructure snakes throughout the West Bank, both underground and in terms of the settlements that are above ground. Israel's control of water Israel's control of the land, Israel's control of the people and of the roads, of everything is not easily converted back into a Palestinian state. It would cost a lot of money to do. It would also mean moving a lot of people around. These are, you know, the moving of that many people, especially considering how many of the Israelis are fanatics. That's politically a very, very high price to pay, even if you're sincere about wanting a Palestinian state. So the point is, fine, if you don't want to abandon the two state, I don't see how you don't. If you want to be realistic, and these people always love saying that they're pragmatic, if you want to be realistic, you have to abandon the two-state solution. But if you want to cling to it irrationally, fine, do that, but not at the exclusion of everything else. You cannot do this. Back to the statement. We strongly support the efforts led by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt to secure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It is a ceasefire, the release of all remaining hostages, and a long-term political solution that offer the best hope of ending the agony of the hostages and their families, alleviating the suffering of civilians in Gaza, ending Hamas's control of Gaza, and achieving a pathway to a two-state solution consistent with the goals of the 18 June conference in New York, co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France. These negotiations need to succeed, and we must all work toward the implementation of a two-state solution, which is the only way to bring long-lasting peace and security that both Israelis and Palestinians deserve and ensure long-term stability in the region. Okay, so this is basically, the most of this is kind of standard sort of boilerplate language, but there are a couple of points. Of course, the two-state solution thing I've already covered. Ending Hamas's control of Gaza could be done pretty easily, I think, if you just actually held a vote, because I doubt they would. I doubt the people of Gaza would vote for Hamas. Every indication is they would not. What people in Gaza resist when it comes to getting Hamas out is the idea that they do it at the behest of Israel or the United States or anyone other than themselves. I think Palestinians insist on being able to choose their own government. Gee, what a concept. They insist that Israel does not have the right to determine who will or will not be part of their government. I don't think there's a chance in hell Hamas even comes close to winning an election. They are not particularly beloved in Gaza for a variety of reasons. They weren't before this either. I do think that if the only competition is Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, that's where their greatest chance lies. And so I think what's necessary is to develop a Palestinian politics that is actually representative, which is something Israel and the United States and Europe have never permitted. And that's going back well before the establishment of the State of Israel. I very much suggest reading Rashid Khaldi's excellent book, The Iron Cage, to see some of these dynamics at play. But there are other great sources that really show how colonial powers, even before Israel's creation, really thwarted any attempt by Palestinians to create an independent, not just state, but really an independent political body of their own, which is interesting because that independent political body of their own was actually something even the Israeli right, Jabotinsky, actually did envision as part of the state that he saw way, way down the road. But again, I digress. That would be the best way. Actually, leaving it up to Palestinians would be the best way to make sure that Hamas did not continue to control Gaza. But of course, we know that that's not going to happen because, again, that's Palestinian independence. And as I said earlier, there's every reason that these various parties oppose that. Last paragraph is, we will continue to work with the Palestinian Authority, regional partners, Israel and the United States, to finalize consensus on arrangements for Gaza's future, building on the Arab plan. We affirm the important role of the high-level two-state solution conference at the UN in June in building international consensus around this aim. And we are committed to recognizing a Palestinian state as a contribution to achieving a two-state solution and are prepared to work with others to this end. If they were serious, that's the end of the statement, just so you know. If they were serious, however, they would have recognized a Palestinian state in the document right there, in this statement. Had they done that, it would have been a serious earthquake in Israel. Um, many countries have already recognized Palestine as a state. They have a provisional sort of membership in the UN. This has all been very controversial, and the United States doesn't like it. Too bad. It's the way it is. And that the more countries that do it, the more weight it has, and the more pressure is on Israel. So had they been serious, they would have done that right away, and they should have, quite frankly. But they were there's not yet ready to pick that kind of fight with Israel, and potentially uh, worrying about, I think, how Donald Trump would react to that, feeling that maybe that would be more than Trump's indifference would to a lot of this would bear. But I don't think there's any doubt that this is an outgrowth of Trump Trump's sort of sense of, you do you, I do me kind of a thing. Kind of his approach to this. I think he feels that that uh, Israel is not offering him a lot, and is not necessarily being constructive to his vision of what he wants to see happen in the Middle East. And I think this is kind of his way of pushing back on that without having to actually do anything, and create a political firestorm of his own. Which is surprisingly clever, I think, of Trump, which is what makes me think it's not his idea. In any case, it's, the statement, it's sure it's I'm glad it came. I'm glad they did this, and yay for the UK, France, and Canada, I suppose. But this should have been done a long time ago. The fact that it took this much and got to this point. I mean, you're talking about so many tens of thousands of lives, so many slaughtered babies, so many traumatized kids. I mean, even people who survived this. I can't imagine that anyone comes out of this from Gaza not being permanently traumatized in a way that is going to ruin their lives, could ruin other people's lives. Just an amazingly horrible situation, and not just because of the Israeli bombs and gunfire, but because of the sense that nobody cared. Even now, I mean, this statement, okay, great, but it doesn't match the moment. It does not step up to the gravity of the situation. We'll need to do that, and and I hope that we do. Certainly, Cutting Through will be here to continue to try and push this forward. So, please like, subscribe. If you can support this work, I would really appreciate it. Again, that's mitchellplitnick.substack.com. It also helps, just share these videos, tell your friends what you've learned here, what you've heard here, and anything else you can do. And thank you for all you do. And I will be talking to you soon.